All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to move over here so I don't block the panel. I think that's probably a good visual indicator, as I mentioned before the break. We're going to change it up a little bit. We're going to have some presentation components, of course, to this next section, but it's going to be a little bit more of a discussion-based and a little bit more collaborative, similar to how we ended the morning. So with that, I'm just going to start off with some quick introductions for our next panel discussion section. And I'd like to start off by introducing Anthony Sardella, who's the CEO of Evolve 24. And because I don't understand neuro-based predictive analytics, I'm not going to try and explain what they do. I'm going to let him do that. But he's really helped to put this panel together and for some really inspiring content that I think we're all going to be excited about. He's joined today by John Osei, who's the Director of Analytics at Ameren, as well as Philip Bane, who's the Managing Director of the Smart Cities Council. And you're probably like, well, what's the Smart Cities Council? Or maybe you already know. We're going to make sure and clarify that as well. But I'm really excited because I actually get to turn it over now to Professor Seethu Seetharaman, who I mentioned I work closely with in the center, as well as some other initiatives. And he's going to really help to drive this discussion as the panel moderator. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Seethu, and we're going to go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Michael. So it's great to see all of you. So thanks for coming and supporting us as always. This is the 4th time we are running this conference. All I wanted to do before we got going, because I'm looking forward to hearing from them, to be honest with you, is to recognize our ex-dean. You all saw our current dean in the morning, Mark, who kicked things off. But I would like to recognize ex-dean Mahendra Gupta, who is sitting right there. Mahendra, can you just show hands? It gives me great pleasure to see him here because when we launched this center 4 years back, when this idea for a center of excellence like this kind of came up, I immediately went to his office and got his blessings in real short order. So I really appreciate the support he gave, and it's great to see the center go from strength to strength, that we are at a point where we are able to drum up this kind of demand. That's all I wanted to say, but I want to hand over the stage back to Michael. Did you introduce our presenters already? So we are all set. Yeah. So
I think I was nominated, right?
Yes,
to go first, yeah. As somebody said, I was volunteered. Good morning. My name is Philip Bane. I'm the Managing Director of Smart Cities Council. Thank you to Washington U and Tony for inviting me here. I've been to St. Louis many times, and I appreciate the opportunity to come and visit with you. I find it was really interesting to see the title, Data for Good. I think that values and data are important. I would have loved to have seen a panel on privacy in that regard today. I think I will try to weave in some privacy concerns and also issues that those who are disadvantaged and don't have access to data do. I'm known for some pretty strong sort of statements. I believe that startups tend to be just especially in the incubation culture, tend to be a reinforcement of sort of white privilege. And so I really look for, I travel all around the world and work with startups and companies. We're funded by industry. I'm very proud to say that we are a for-profit company. We do good and we do well. We're very successful financially. We're funded by about 160 companies around the world. Some of our biggest partnerships are with utilities. Edison Electric Institute, which represents all the large utilities in the United States, is one of our biggest members. I'm proud to say Evolve 24 is one of our members. We've worked closely with Tony and the company to develop what Tony will talk about, well-being indicators. But let me tell you a little bit about what we do. We were founded to essentially educate cities on how to use technology to be livable, workable, and sustainable. So in other words, a triple bottom line approach. We have 4 regional centers. One is in Australia, the other is in India, the other is in Europe, and the other is in North America. We probably some of the most extensive knowledge resources in the world. We have over 5,000 people a month come in and use our resources to study how to improve their cities, and I'll explain a little bit what the city sort of view or interface is with technology, which is key here. We have, in the last 4 years, provided 60 what we call readiness workshops around the world for populations in total of over 200 million. They've ranged from Australia all the way through India, Europe, the United States, Dubai, Singapore, places in South Africa. And essentially, we've identified two of the biggest problems that cities have. The first is a lack of capacity, an inability to understand or resource the benefits of technology. And so to a certain extent, there's a real disconnect between what we're talking about here and what cities can make available to help themselves, okay? We were talking earlier about how hard it is for a utility to hire a data analyst or a data scientist. It's almost out of the realm of possibility of a city. And if you're a city in Africa, it's even harder, or in India, it's harder. And why are cities important? You know, we had in the morning somewhat of a discussion around financial characteristics of individuals. And I appreciated what was said from Equifax and MasterCard about how they look at individual data. And you know, Equifax was talking about how they credential personal finance. And it quickly came to me, if I wanted to put a city in the construct of where we all sit in our credit ratings, essentially, you know, a city is a rent-starved, cash-based, paycheck to paycheck with poor credit rating. I mean, that's where cities are, you know, and we don't think of it that way. You know, New York has $1 billion budget, 90 million is spent on IT. I was talking with John about the problems that St. Louis has on budgets and the inability to fund this really admirable project. But imagine we have 8 cities in North America that are over 1 million people. In Europe, they have over 12 cities. Anybody have an idea how many cities in Africa are over 1 million people? 40, and it's growing. The largest population centers in the world are outside of Africa, are in the ASEAN 10-country network, which is from China down to Australia. I was just in Singapore working, they're going to launch a 26 smart cities network, and the problem they have is Singapore is truly one of the most top users of technology, as is Dubai. But you go literally 100 miles into Kuala Lumpur, or you go, you know, 400 miles south to Jakarta, is it something like that, and you have a totally different environment, and you have people who don't have access. And then you go, I met people from Myanmar, you know, who are trying to figure out how to use technology, and you can imagine what their issues were. So we've done a tremendous amount of work in India. We've supported the government in its 100 smart cities. We were hired by both the US government and Indian government to give workshops throughout India about how do you use technology. And you know, India has a tremendous technology prowess. They also have smart cities that were over 4,000 years old. Most of us don't realize that, you know. They knew how to use water before anybody in the North America did. So the reason I'm making this context is because there's a huge gap between what we're talking about today and what's available to cities. And the more valuable data becomes, the less accessible it becomes to cities, okay? Now, one of the things that St. Louis did that I just have to really admire is it has an open data portal. And there are 2,600 around the world. IDC just reported that. And that is usually the first step. But what is that a real recognition of? You could see that as a technology recognition, but really what it's a recognition is that we're all in this together, that you need to have stakeholders involved. And you need to have a lot of different types of data sets to come up with the necessary analytics. So someone in the audience this morning was saying that there were like 11, I think the number was 11,000 NGOs in the St. Louis area. And one of the big problems for NGOs is they truly don't understand how to use the data, and nobody really knows what data they have, okay? And so we have a project. I'm a lawyer by education, but a technologist by training. I've managed massive data projects. I've taken a company public. And you always have to take language and make it accessible to people. Just like I said, the data has to be accessible, so does the language. And one of the things that we came up with was a concept called compassionate cities that we've been rolling out. And compassionate cities, I'm often told that I'm all head and no heart. And so what I found that the technique to do was to think about what it took to be compassionate and then integrate it into my heart. I'm a yoga teacher now, and it's all about integration. So, but this is true with data. You have to find ways to integrate the benefits that you're talking about to different populations. So we came up with the idea that the right use case for compassionate cities was one more use case. So in other words, if you have an engineering background, and I suspect the bulk of us in this room have some, you understand use cases and stories. So generally you're paid to put together a story or a use case around, let's extend mobility benefits, reduce traffic congestion for all the people with cars in the society, right? So you're paid the money to do it, you do it. Well, if you have a compassionate city, what you do is you go, oh, guess what? Let's add a use case here. And that use case is for those who can't afford a car, okay? Those who walk. So it's taking this value approach, but it's extending it into our taxonomy so that it's workable, that it's usable. And this is a big piece of what has to happen when you're working with cities. I'll give you one story that's one of my favorite. A lot of times we sit at the table sort of at the intersection of utilities, telecommunication providers, solution providers, and the cities themselves. So I was down in North Carolina. I can't say too much exactly where it was. And there was a small city of about 30,000 people that, because it had some valuable land, was going to grow to about 400,000 in 7 years. So, there are only 100 cities in the United States that are over 100,000. So if you're growing from 30 to 400, you're really climbing up the ladder in terms of having a large population with responsibility. We were at the room, and Duke was at the room, and Duke is very good about figuring out how to extend its networks, add value to its networks. They're really beginning to see this. Other than Enel, the Italian utility, and SCC, Southern Cal Edison, Duke is one of the most entrepreneurial in understanding that they have existing networks that can be used to capture data through sensors that can be used for data analytics. So we were all sitting in the room, and we had a 6-hour discussion about how we were going to help make this community smart. And at 3:45, the person from the small town raised his hand. And he said, well, you guys, I got like 15 minutes. We said, well, gosh, we had planned to 6. There's a lot to go over. And he says, I'm sorry. The dog license office opens at 4:15, and I got to issue dog licenses. So it was like, oh, this is a different world. This is a different construct. And this is where, as a person who's studying data analytics, you have to understand the other party's perception. We're having problems with 5G right now in some cities because, just like with smart meters, 5G is seen possibly as having health problems. I guarantee you, if you go into cities and start talking, and what we're going to talk about with well-being, Tony and I have really looked into this deeply, the issues of privacy. And you walk into an echo chamber, and you walk into a loud echo chamber. And if you're not prepared to deal with privacy, forget hacks. I'm talking more about Facebook issues, right? And I'm talking about people using your data to monetize that data for their own purposes. And there's huge issues around that you need to be aware of if you're in the data analytics field. So I know we're going to cover a lot of different subjects, but what I did want to just mention was that we've been working with Evolve 24, and I'm very proud of this, because I'm just going to give a little preview, if you don't mind, Tony. But I want to talk about Aristotle, so you'll let me do that, right? Yeah. Okay. So the reason when Tony came to us and said that we have this tremendous scientific approach that's scientifically based, that measures the well-being of a community, it really fascinated me right away. And the reason I say this is, and this ties in a little bit with the interface with cities, is that if you go to city leaders and you talk about you're a smart city because you have this many smart streetlights or this many smart meters, or you've been able to reduce traffic congestion by this % because you have this many AVs, or whatever other piece of technology you want to talk about, you've totally missed the mark, okay? Because that politician, that leader, that civic leader is interested in the well-being of their community. And there are about 270 different indicators around the world about how do you measure a smart future. Just go on and on and on about the cities. And they all tend to, except for Gallup, and Evolve 24, there's only 2 organizations in the world that are actually measuring community well-being, which is about how does that community thrive. And Aristotle had said, and I remember when we started working together, we talked about this, the goal of any human being is to flourish. And I love that because it's an active, positive word. It's not perfect. And how I flourish in the Kalahari Desert may be different than how you flourish in San Francisco or St. Louis or anywhere else. And it takes into account that we all sort of have our individual intrinsic drivers. So the real value of using something other than scientific hard measurements to measure the progress of our data analytics reflects this idea that as a community we're flourishing. So I'll leave it for there, and then obviously we'll jump in as Tony and John get going. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I'm a new move-in, so I got here about 6 months ago, and I've just thoroughly enjoyed my time here in St. Louis so far. I had an opportunity to make a career change for myself. I've been in a number of different industries, as my profile said in my bio, and I really was excited about the opportunity to come to St. Louis and to join Ameren and to use data for good. I've done a lot with data in my career. I've pushed drugs, charged fees, and put all kinds of stuff on TV. A million channels nobody's going to watch. And to be able to have the opportunity to come here to St. Louis and partner with Ameren and really help lead out in their data and analytics space, I'm just really excited. Ameren made an investment a few years ago to really start focusing on analytics. I know we have some of our leaders here, some of our team here today from Ameren. I'm excited that they could be here as well. With Ameren, we have a great stewardship for our community, a great responsibility. And I think, when you go to Ameren and you talk with them, they talk about safety first, safety in everything, because the people that really do the work at Ameren, not me, an office worker, but the folks out in the field, dealing with the energy grid, they put their lives on the line every day dealing with, the power lines and the energy distribution system we have. And, kudos to them. And, if anybody of you have relatives or have done this work or have friends that do this work, thank you. Supporting our energy grid and the critical infrastructure that we have in the U.S. is really an important thing, and we're really proud of those that do that. So proud, in fact, that safety being really important. Our analytics team, actually, the advanced analytics team last year did some research on how we could promote safety in the work crews that are out there doing the work. So they gathered data from all sorts of places around incidents that have happened, time of day, weather, and they did some predictive analytics around the conditions in which there's a possibility of having accidents of various types. And so that information is actually used now in the field to warn folks about the conditions that they're in as they're working to watch out for certain things to avoid any accidents. And it's a great thing because we want to make sure that every one of our coworkers at Ameren comes home the same way they went to work, even office workers. And we get coached on that a lot. I've learned very quickly to stop texting while I'm walking on the stairs, to pull over and do that. It's not just texting while driving, it's texting while walking. But like I said, at Ameren, we have a duty and responsibility to help with the well-being of our community. And as David talked earlier, and Philip shared a minute ago, in the city it's very challenging, right? Low income, poverty levels that are higher here. People that are challenged, right, we call it an energy burden. The energy burden for low-income families is much higher than most people, and that can be very problematic. So Ameren does a lot to try, and we use our data to try to find ways to help our community that way. We do a lot of things, volunteerism, accelerator programs, all kinds of interesting and innovative things. But when it comes to helping those that are, in need, we focus a lot on energy efficiency, and about energy assistance. For us, it's really about powering the quality of life. And, energy is just a big piece of that quality of life that you just have to have. And so for us, energy efficiency programs and, being new, I probably haven't been as involved with it as some of you may have been. So some of you may have a lot more knowledge about that than I do. But, we'll be active in the community working with industrial, commercial, in terms of looking at the equipment that people are going to replace or install to make sure it's highly energy efficient so we can be good for the environment. And we'll offer incentives to help people make sure they're installing good equipment that's going to be more green. We'll work with residential programs and lighting, and there's a lot of work we do on that. But when it comes to the low income, one of the things that we've done recently is one of our groups prepared a heat map that allowed us to focus in on the schools within the city that we could reach out to. And we have curriculum and education programs that we develop that the teachers can take to the students. It includes a kit that they can take home as homework so that they can take that to their home. Because in the city and in some of the places around here, the homes are so old that they have electrical issues and they're very drafty. And so the folks that really need the help the most have the worst energy efficient home that that you could possibly have. And so we do a lot with weatherization. So we use data to find multi-family dwelling units and have a program there where if there's a certain percentage of the multi-family dwelling unit that is below the poverty line, we'll actively reach out to and work with the landlord to do weatherization, caulking, pipe taping, even replacing refrigerators as necessary. Some of those are so old, they're so inefficient. That's in equipment in the shared equipment in the facility itself to really drive the energy efficiency and drive costs down for those that live there. I'm excited. I don't have a lot to share because I'm still new and learning every day. I'm changing industries again, so all kinds of new acronyms. But I'm excited about where we're going to go with energy. It's a really innovative space at this time. Everybody knows with distributed energy resources, solar, wind, and electric vehicles. And Ameren is going to be a key player in that. And analytics is a big part of that, making sure that we're using that data to drive investment and innovation for the community, and especially for those that are in need. I'm passionate about using data for good, and I'm excited to be here and to learn more even from the panel here. Again, new to St. Louis, love it here, plan to be here for a while, and plan to use my knowledge and experience in other industries and bring that to bear for Ameren. So thank you.
Tony?
Thanks, Seethu. Yeah, I'll give a little background on Evolve 24. As Michael said, I'll demystify the neuroscience and predictive analytics. Evolve 24 is a predictive analytics company, and most of our work is with commercial companies to help make better decisions. Those are decisions about how to allocate their resources, people, finances. And they could be around what products to invest in so they can grow, where to innovate in new areas, how to position themselves to match with where trends are going. Our ability really is underpinned by a core data science capability for being able to discover and predict the trajectory of trends. These could be societal trends, they could be technical trends, consumer trends. And one of the trends that we discovered several years back or more was this concept of smart cities. And as we were looking, got to know Phil and understand his counsel and globally, this huge effort, incredible amount of investment and effort by corporations and cities as well, to drive towards greater efficiency of cities. And I thought something was really, really missing. After teaching, thanks to Mahendra and allowing me to teach for over a decade, he had enough foresight to add to the curriculum a program called the Societal Environment of Business. And so we teach that here at the university. And after teaching, and I looked at this whole initiative, I couldn't help but say something is fundamentally missing. And as I looked at it, what I thought was similar to businesses, being able to enable cities and these companies to truly understand when they were making investments if it was fostering greater well-being of the citizens of the community. We opened up with the dialogue about shared value, having a company that once again is a positive contributor to society, which is not what most people think. But likewise, with cities, how are they making decisions and prioritizing allocations to really drive the well-being of their citizens? So I came back and I approached some really talented people at Evolve 24 who are also adjuncts here at the university. Dr. Tony Heinrichs, who's our chief data scientist. Where's Tony? Tony's right there. And one of our lead program developers, Andrea DiGiovanni, who runs massive global research programs for us. And I started asking, what could we do in this area? And we asked ourselves some questions. What additional measures could we bring to bear for cities and companies that would allow them to understand how they are impacting well-being of the citizens? Second thing was, could we actually quantify something like this? Because if we could quantify how companies, programs, and decisions contribute to well-being of citizens, this could open up a whole new area of understanding for improved decision-making. We talked about the cities having massive constraints, people, budget. So prioritization is so important to know where can I invest to have the most significant impact on well-being. So could we quantify it? If we quantified it, could we really tie it to true outcome variables? You know, it's good to feel good, but can you quantify that by improving well-being, you made a difference economically and otherwise in the communities you're in and you're governing? And then the other part is, could it then allow for greater and better resource allocations, just like company, but for cities as well? And so here's what we found, actually. The team, led by Tony and Andrea, started discovering that first, you can, in fact, quantify subjective well-being, something that was very, well, soft, but you could quantify it using data, techniques, and tools. Secondly, lo and behold, we were able to show relationships. It's still early. We're doing a lot of studies across many different cities, but we started showing relationships to subjective well-being and real hard outcomes in a city. And then lastly, being able to rank and stack programs, company programs, civic programs, in regards to which ones are the most efficacious in regards to enhancing well-being, such that you could prioritize them and make greater decision frameworks. So this is what we found. Now, first I have to tell you, what is subjective well-being, right? Most of us tend to think it's about happiness, right? If you're happy, you're in a state of well-being. Well, that's one dimension. In over 20 years plus, I was actually surprised as our scientists and psychologists and social scientists research this field. There's over 20 plus years of research in this area. And these are all the dimensions. And so from an effect, which is more linked to happiness, was only one driver. Well-being was also fostered by these other areas. So is there strong formation of relationships in your community, with your families? Was there a sense of purpose? Where and how do you find meaning in your life? Where do you get that meaning? Right? From focus, was there things that within the community you could immerse yourself and tie your passion, your own personal passion to? And then some of the others, fulfillment, sense of accomplishment, of achievement, health, not just personal physical health, but mental health. Was that, were you growing and flourishing, as Phil had said? And then from tying all these, they all have different contributions. We were able to start understanding, how could we measure this? And the idea was, could we take all the public conversations and digital content, something that we have strong capabilities at Evolve 24 of doing, to understand all these dimensions to then create a well-being score that we could use? Now, we had a lot of thoughts about, is it even possible, right? Is the data available? Is the right data available? Could we get the data? What about making sure that we abided by ethical aspects of privacy? Could we completely ensure it was anonymized? Was the data going to be representative of only certain populations, or was it truly going to be representative of the entire communities, right, in these cities? And then one of the ones that we were kind of taken aback by was the enormous amount of research of, is all this digital content that gets shared about one's life and one's experiences and how you feel, is it really honest? And what we found through looking through just a massive amount of research was, in fact, the right data was readily available, that it was representative of numerous different populations, that a lot of our biases around who uses social content or digital content or posts information was an error, that we had false biases around who uses it and how they use it. Pew Research Center did just an incredible study, and if you haven't been able to see it, go on their site, really got to the depth of demographic, race, income, et cetera, in regard urban, rural communities and their usage and penetration of these tools to share how they feel about different areas. And so it gave us a little more confidence that we could, in fact, get the right data, that we could get anonymized data that complied and respected privacy, that that data was going to be open and honest, and that it was going to be representative of the communities. And so as we and the team started looking at it and quantifying those 6 attributes, we started testing, well, what could it tell us? And very early, but we started finding some striking relationships. We did 6 cities plus Washington, D.C., Santa Monica, and in St. Louis in our study. And we're continuing to grow to over 50 cities here in the United States and international in this regard. And while these are directional, they're pretty significant takeaways. What we found was that affect, this feeling of happiness and optimism, was in fact related to economic indicator like housing starts. In St. Louis, we found could quantify how it was related to it. It was also interesting, the speakers earlier around housing vacancies and home vacancies, and how that was related to later needs for mental health and physical health services, and could understand the demands that would become downstream a few months later. Again, allowing for resource allocations and anticipating needs in the community that would then improve subjective well-being. And the one that was quite also interesting to us was well-being and crime on both sides. It was quite interesting. Pretty well across all the cities, we found these type of relationships, different magnitudes, different quantities. But what was interesting was crime and well-being. And on the first hand, we saw in some cities this relationship as purpose in regards to finding, it could be a religious purpose, a purpose in life, having some central purpose as to how you find meaning in your life, how that was related either as citizens were finding greater purpose in their community, how crime was decreasing. But then we found something interesting in St. Louis. We found this community here was rejecting crime as an option, that later we found that they moved towards other ways, other manifestations for them to find meaning in their life. Community serving, religious, serving others. And so this was quite profound for us in regards to the value of well-being. Now, just to manifest this, I had the pleasure, like 5 years ago or so, to do a TEDx talk. And I got to meet a gentleman who's called the Gorilla Gardener. Has anyone ever heard of him? If you haven't, it's an amazing TED Talk. The Gorilla Gardener, he was really bothered by the poverty and crime in a suburb of LA, one of the worst suburbs in the area. And he decided that he would give a purpose. He didn't state it that way, but he said he was going to create a purpose beyond crime. And he started planting vegetables and fruits in every boulevard in the entire area. And what he found was, as he was doing this, the community was coming together. People were taking care of these tomatoes and all these type of fruits and vegetables, and they were eating them, and they were bringing them back. They had this purpose to get up really early in the morning, make sure they watered it. The problem was the city shut him down. The city shut him down because they didn't know how to deal with this. They viewed it as an obstruction, right? So you could see how these linkages to understand when he established this really entertaining TED Talk, when he established this kind of program, the program was having a significant impact on the reduction of crime in those local communities which had been ridden by crime. But the officials had no perspective to understand how to quantify the value of that program. And by attaching it to a view of improving subjective well-being, they could then meet their goals of reducing crime, increasing safety. But those connections weren't made. And so these were some of the data points. And then what about St. Louis? Every city has its own personality, is what we found. If you look at Los Angeles, their well-being is heavily driven by a sense of purpose, where they find meaning and where they create value in their lives. You look at some of the other cities like D.C., it was about focus. Where could they completely commit themselves to make some sort of difference? You probably see that from a D.C. government and public policy. What we came out very strongly with were these 2 attributes that drove our well-being in our community. And one was fulfillment and a sense of accomplishment. The degree we felt a sense of accomplishment and achievement, we felt greater and better and stronger well-being among ourselves and our community. And that's pride in family, education at a wonderful top national university like Washington University, great pride around our education and growth. Many of you are students, and so have that pride of being or alum or a student of our university. But then also even in regards to sports, our relationship with our sports team and how it's fostering community. And maybe sometimes we know that, but we quantified that relationship across all these other cities. The next one was relationships. Relationships were absolutely important to fostering greater well-being and driving greater well-being in St. Louis. And that's about not just family relationships, community relationships, relationships between companies and businesses, et cetera. So the fostering, this is our personality from the data, which is different from the other cities, and we should be very proud of it. These are obviously, all these attributes are important, but it's very, very proud to understand what makes us feel we have greater well-being. And you know, we started then saying, well, you know, if a company is deciding where to fund and support community initiatives, have they been creating any impact to well-being of the St. Louis community? And what we found was some tremendous insights. One that I'll highlight it was a surprise to us. We kind of thought the Muni and the Arch and the Zoo, the Zoo won a national award. It's one of the most ideal facilities and attractions in the country. Shakespeare in the Park. If you're not familiar with Shakespeare in the Park, it's not just about Shakespeare in the Park, but reaching out to schools and communities. We're taken aback at how highly that ranked to tie the communities. Now, something like that would be more unique for St. Louis, given that relationships drives our sense of well-being. And so programs will differ as to their efficacy, and that was absolutely a core one for us. But, you know, congratulations to these wonderful firms that have really helped and put money, and to date, wouldn't have known how much they were contributing to the community's well-being in a significant way that led to some of those economic, crime, and health outcomes. Now, two that we wanted to point out that as we looked at all the programs, my colleague John and the work that they're doing at Ameren statistically ranked among the very highest, which is why I wanted to ask them to come and talk a little about what they were doing in regards to programs that foster well-being. And the idea is that as companies spend great amounts in their corporate social responsibility efforts, knowing which ones are really having the biggest impact and how they're impacting people in the communities. And there's a whole slew. And United Way, secondly, I don't know if we have anyone from the United Way here with us, but some incredible programs that are driving very positive effect, that feeling of happiness and positive optimism in the community to drive well-being. It's having an impact, a significant statistical impact on well-being. So what we found out, just to wrap up, is lo and behold, even though it was a real preliminary type of initiative, we could quantify subjective well-being. We could not only do that, but could tie it to real economic outcomes. So once and for all, when we do these initiatives, we can say it's having an impact and it's having a real financial impact. And we were able to derive really a first kind of view of how to allow city and corporations to make better decisions about prioritizing their efforts and their resource allocations, both monetarily and people-wise, be it volunteerism or funding like we heard earlier today, or even programs that they might launch. So we're really proud to do this study and to have the team provide these insights and to share a little bit with you about how data now as a first, let's say 1.0, could lead to even greater good as we understand its relationship and the contribution to well-being of citizens and society. So thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Okay, now we will transition into the roundtable aspect of this discussion. Now, given the time and given the fact that earlier in the morning I saw questions coming, fast and furious from the audience, and since you have taken the time, I want to be a little bit more democratic, even though we have called it a roundtable. So I want to kind of intersperse how I pick their brain with my own questions, with questions that keep coming from the audience, instead of holding ourselves to a fixed agenda of let's get the roundtable going and then get you to participate, right? So feel free to raise your hands and ask questions of any of our guests. But maybe I'll start the discussion by mentioning a couple of, this was fascinating. I think two of you kind of from the Smart Cities Initiative and Compassionate Cities, and Ameren trying to kind of hone in on underserved or communities in need of some special targeting. So let me start, before I, in fact, start, I was reminded, Tony, when you mentioned this gorilla gardener, is that of, which way is Skinker? How many of you have seen that lady, the construction lady who kind of works at Skinker? And as academics, we rely more on statistics, less on anecdotes. But still, in terms of interventions on how to kind of raise people's spirits and how to make the community just happier or more positive affect, I thought that might be a nice intervention to test in some more systematic manner. That lady who just exudes happiness, and kind of every car that goes by is looking for, hey, where did she go today? Show me hands if you know who I am talking about. So there you go. If you haven't paid attention, the next time you drive on Skinker and you're between Forsyth and Forest Park Parkway, look to your left.
And Seethu, I'm happy to mention that the Los Angeles City Council reversed their ordinance and allowed the gorilla gardener to continue understanding its value on well-being. So,
okay, now this question let me throw to our guests, and any of you feel free to jump in. It's a two-pronged question. So when I think smart cities, I'm thinking of all the buzz that the Amsterdam smart city movement kind of caught a few years back. So I'd like you to comment on it. Does that relate to what you're doing in any way at all? If so, maybe you can enlighten us by telling us a little bit about that Amsterdam, what made Amsterdam one of the early kind of smart cities, and how that ties into what you're doing. And the second part is talking about affect as well-being, subjective well-being requiring some measures, some components of itself. Have you looked into this gross national happiness metric that Bhutan seems to be using in that part of the world where I grew up? And they seem to rely on that GNP measure more than the traditional GNP or GDP that we are used to. So let's start with that.
the happiness one?
Sure, go ahead.
The smart city or happiness either.
Yeah, we actually did extensive look, and we realized there's quite a few different countries and cities. Dubai, who wants to be the happiest place on earth, and the happiest city. And what we found was in our assessment that was actually a flawed metric, that it was only one of the 6 contributors to well-being. And so by focusing solely on happiness, you were really lacking the true construct of what drove a citizen and a human being's well-being. It's an important metric, but it's one of 6 that one has to look at. You have to start somewhere, and so I applaud them for starting in regards to one place, and I applaud them for putting the citizens' happiness on the radar to measure it. And really, there's continuing to use that as a proxy to judge and evaluate the programs and decisions that they make around different initiatives in their cities. But as we found, it takes all 6 constructs to truly get a measure that is valid to determine the well-being of citizens.
And adding to that, I mean, we've done a lot of work with Evolve 24, so I sometimes feel like I co-own this whole thing. It's really interesting in our journey in talking to cities about well-being. The first thing I want to say is, I mean, I go all around the world talking to people, and the well-being theme has got to be the one I get the most response on. Across the world, as soon as we bring it up, as soon as we touch into a little bit of the research that's been done, there's just a burning interest in it. It's amazing, and of course, because it's about us. Why not? You know, it's not about things. It's about people, and I think that really it relates. But it also relates to people who are leaders, because in the end, they are shepherds. They're there to shepherd their communities, and anything that helps them lead and evaluate and make decisions. When we were first introducing this in the United States, this is one of my favorite stories. We were talking, actually we were talking about this last night, we were talking to some people from Philadelphia, and we were dealing with some pretty, senior, older politicians, almost as white and as bald and as heavy as I was, and we're all sitting around the table, and we're all sort of, and we're talking about this, and it was really interesting because we had 2 generations there from Philadelphia. And the older person who was the leader said, "We don't need this. How do you think we've kept control of City Hall for 20 years? We know this stuff. It's instinctual. You know, and if you think, most of the data stuff that we do, in some ways, is a more statistical iteration of what we do as human beings. You know, we have more sensors and more ability to analyze, but essentially we are data crunching devices ourselves with pretty sophisticated sensors. And you don't stay as a mayor of a city or a city council person if you don't have the instincts. But what was interesting was this idea that Evolve 24 is using, and the younger generation at the table really attracted to this. So Gallup does a very admirable well-being poll. I think it's almost like 200 nations. They've done it for 15 years. But what is the one problem with a polling approach? Question bias, and it's past data, right? So the approach that Evolve 24 takes with social media is that it's current, you don't have question bias, but you also can find things that you don't ask about, which is really what, as a leader, you want to know. You want to know what you don't know. And that was one of the beauties of the approach with what Evolve 24 was doing. And you know, there's a public policy ethical line there you have to be careful about, obviously, because it can be used for control. But it's just a very interesting dilemma. Like Dubai is just using happiness. They're using a 4 algorithm set. You guys use a 6 algorithm set. It's past data versus current data. There's these kind of, anybody who spends time in, you know, logic and math appreciate these distinctions. But going to your first question just quickly, we've been working in this space, like I said, for about 6 years. And essentially Smart Cities was created by IBM. You know, smart world, smart water, smart transportation. They've actually given up that marketing after spending hundreds of millions of dollars on it. It's really, I find it interesting because the first company to write a check for us was IBM. And now we have companies coming in that are competitors to IBM, and they talk about smart this and smart that like it was just created. You know, I mean, it's just, you know, and if you spend any time in the smart grid, which really took off about 86, 87, you know the whole technology basis for a smart city. I mean, you understand it completely. But we're very careful about how we talk about this because in the United States, because we're probably more accepting of marketing messages, you know, we'll live with the word smart and we'll just sort of roll with it. But if I'm in Europe and I use the word smart, I mean, I'm basically thrown out of the room because it's commercial. It's seen as being associated with IBM. They want to use the word future, green. A big word that's used in Europe is sharing. You know, the whole idea of the sharing economy. So we're very careful about this. I mean, we call ourselves the Smart Cities Council, but in the end, it is about future, it's about sharing, it's about green. A big theme that we're dealing with now, we just got a huge, very big grant about resiliency and we're putting on a big workshop in Puerto Rico on December 4th and 5th about how to use technology to make the island more resilient. In other words, how to prevent future problems. But as much as we're doing technology, you know, it's not about technology, it's about people. And that's where you have to be careful as a data scientist, is that if you lose that equation of understanding that it's about people and their understanding and they have to see the benefits, and this is our big dilemma with Puerto Rico, because, you know, we want to go in and all the people that fund us want to talk about how they can build smarter roads or dikes or this, that, or the other. And our view of it is, no, we have to work to build resilient communities. You know, it's the people that need to be resilient, not necessarily the infrastructure. So we see the whole SMART movement really as an invitation for human communities to deal with change. I mean, it's as simple as that. And, you know, you face change for economic problems, man-made, natural, and the question is how resilient is your community? So that's our definition of smart cities.
Maybe one more question and then I'll throw it open. I'll start with you, John, at Ameren. Maybe this ties in with what you're doing, and then take Tony and Philip as well. How do you feel big data analytics can, you know, transform corporate social responsibility programs in general, you know, across industry, across companies?
Yeah, I think it comes down to understanding your customer, and obviously in Ameren, right, you know, basically everybody's a customer, right? So and that gets a little bit, this is a little slippery slope for us, right? Because we don't typically, market, but at the same time, we do need to market. We need to encourage people to be more environmentally conscious. So we have cases where, there's individuals who just basically use the set it and forget it method of, energy, right? They just pay their bill automatically and they don't think about it, right? But they should think about it, right? And so how do we use data to tease out who those individuals are, and then how can we help to influence them to be more thought conscious about the environment and help move them in that direction? And using large data sets and additional data that we may not have, we may need to acquire, can help us do that. But again, that's a slippery slope, because we're not trying to sell more. We're trying to get people to be more conscious about their energy choices. In addition to just helping the underprivileged, right, which is a huge thing for us. Trying to make sure that we're connecting people to energy assistance programs. So getting data from that to be able to match that up, so that if you've been involved in an energy assistance program during the winter and the cold months, that we can proactively give you a heads up as it starts to become warm to reach out to get energy assistance in the summer, so that you don't have a life-altering event that could affect you. So having access to this data and then an environment to analyze that and to use that for good, I think even applies for us.
Tony?
Yeah, very interesting. I think of it two ways. I think the first from the data is they'll know corporate social responsibility programs they'll be able to make better understanding where they need to focus, right? What things are driving well-being and where can they focus their programs first. Secondly, being able to critique, are their programs having an impact, rack and stack them, and understand the ones that are having the greatest. Might be execution issues, but from a fundamental, which ones are racking, stacking. But I see now with this field, in fact, just recently, some colleagues published a whole journal, entire journal committed to big data and well-being and understanding it. It was just published about a month ago. And what I find is starting to occur is that the social responsibility and the product and business strategies are going to be combined even more. And here's why I say that. So how does the iPhone as a product create greater well-being of a citizen? How do any of the products and services that companies are providing create greater or destroy well-being? And so what I think is that whereas sustainability programs have really sat separate, right, and very focused on environmental, that these type of metrics that will be derived from data will allow evaluation of the products, the experiences, and the service on a completely different dimension, which is not just its performance and value, but how it is or isn't creating or destroying well-being of the users. And I think that will fundamentally change the value from a business perspective of social responsibility if corporations leverage big data within that discipline. Right? And so that's how I see it fundamentally shifting, being more strategic in products, being more strategic in experiences, and using it as quantification of the company.
Oh, that's great. Anything to add, Philip?
You don't want my answer. If you need big data to be corporately responsible, you got a problem.
That's true.
So.
So the well-being score, I think is really fascinating. It directly connects with a concept that's being discussed really highly in healthcare, which is the social determinants of health. Mm-hmm. And I noticed in your presentation that healthcare was not very well represented. So I'm curious how you see hospital systems, health plans connecting to your work and how those sectors fit in.
Yeah, and so first on that note, you saw a lot even earlier on with our other presentations about how a lot of these factors tie together. So first, just being able to quantify. These were just some of the ones. And there's definitely relationships in the category of health and mental well-being. Absolutely. I just chose to focus on the area where the predominant drivers in St. Louis was relationships, right, and fulfillment. But there are very much relationships, and happy to share some of the rest of it as we publish some of this data and make it more available. But absolutely the role of healthcare providers, service providers to foster greater physical and mental health as a form of creating well-being, there is a very strong relationship there.
And I think, especially like some of the things that you mentioned, fulfillment, purpose,
Right.
relationship, are huge drivers of things like addiction and suicide, and those sorts of things I think are going to be huge to pay attention to going forward.
Just tremendous insight. I don't know if we want to get the mic as such a powerful insight about how, do you mind repeating it for everybody, Wilfred, so they hear it? I wouldn't want anyone to lose that insight.
So some of the factors that are put into this well-being score, fulfillment, purpose, relationships, are huge drivers of things like addiction and suicide, major health crisis epidemics that we're having right now, and are going to be a huge area of focus going forward.
And you start being able to understand why housing vacancies are so vital when you start understanding that downstream it's going to necessitate greater mental and physical health because of these situations of how they cope, how they deal with the stress and anxiety that's being created, which is driving their well-being down. So you're absolutely correct. Those are highly tied and need to be quantified so we can understand the importance of them. Yeah.
But Tony, a piece of that, did you have a follow-up on that? And then, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, right there.
You have to travel far.
So when you came up with these 6 dimensions for well-being, can you tell me like how you actually came up with these things? How do you prove that they're all mutually exclusive and that they're a complete description of well-being? Yeah, things like that.
So first, we leveraged the literature, medical, scientific, social science literature for those 6 areas. So that wasn't something that we derived. We went and looked for it. Our key role was to leverage our analytical capabilities to, in essence, our language algorithms, to extract those concepts from the words that people were using and expressing day to day in all these digital channels. So that was the part we added. But that was based on over 20 years of academic research, social science research, that found those were the key 6 drivers of well-being. And we just leveraged those and utilized those. Yeah.
I have a question about the language that you're using to talk about the subjective metrics of well-being. And when you add subjectivity to any metric, that always worries me. So I want to understand, is the subjectivity with regard to the way that you have collected the data, or with regard to the way that you analyze it, or with regard to the conclusions that you reach because of it? Do you understand my question?
Yeah, I do, and it's one that we've asked ourselves right at the beginning of the research. And so the subjective aspect is that these are all perceptual, right? They're all perceptual. They're citizens communicating about their view in regards to how they feel and how they think. And so the idea there is that it's not known what the so-called true metric might be, but these are subjective in that they're perceptions that people have in the community about the different categories and different areas and different programs. So that was the subjectivity that we defined it as up front.
I'm very interested in the social responsibility part that you are talking about. You said that there is a matrix that can determine whether the product is conforming to the general well-being of people, because I feel like that's a very good insight, because I think a lot of product, I can make some examples like high oil food and a lot of like hamburger, French fries, people like that, but it's gonna cause a health problem to people. So my question is that how is this matrix is being developed, and if that matrix is being developed, what specifically is about that matrix?
Yeah.
Thank you.
And And my view there is that's a place where the metric can be used, so it hasn't been used there. And so to Seethu's point about how could it change social responsibility, the idea that one may have an instrument going forward that could start understanding products and experiences and how it's impacting well-being. We have not conducted that. We've done it only at a programmatic level and at a city level, like attractions and events. But that is a place where the metric could be utilized going downstream by corporate social responsibility departments.
At the back.
Did you assess disenfranchised communities and their perception of well-being? And did you inculcate the notions of power or lack thereof? And what about intersectionality of access and how that contributes to well-being? When you start talking about these 6 domains, it seems a little limiting when you're talking about applying it to people of color or people on the fringes of society.
Yeah. The way it manifests in the data is topical areas of conversation within each of those. So if it wasn't that we looked at the data only for their expression of I feel fulfilled, but the categories of discussion, and some of those would appear, right? So they would appear under the different categories. And as such, they did manifest. They did manifest in the data where those expressions were. And they would roll up to then, well, they're feeling a sense of lack of purpose or lack of fulfillment because of those conversations, because of those topics, because of those issues. And that's the beauty. When I said the ability to know where to focus is the first value of it. Beyond just even measuring it, where does one need to focus attention and resources? And then secondly, once you've applied resources, how effective is it? And that's where we can identify at a very granular level. Phil talked about the surveys, and one of the other gaps there is you cannot get to those details. You cannot get to the foundational details that are driving that higher order fulfillment, purpose, focus. But by letting the voices speak and taking it in their words as to what's giving them a feeling of lack or thereof well-being within those categories, we can discover them without knowing to ask them. And so that's one of the most promising aspects of the research. Still very early, but we think it's very promising to be able to unlock these questions in these areas. Yeah.
Because fundamentally, the source, the instance of data is the words being used by people themselves. I mean, that's where the data comes from. It's, and then there's some filtering and text extraction and analysis that occurs, but fundamentally it's what people are saying in their own lives.
And the concepts you brought up are very much in the data. They do exist.
This,
Thanks.
I mean, well, first of all, let's give a round of applause to our
Greg? No?
Sure.
Sorry, I thought I'd have a chance to say this. We run a challenge throughout North America. This is the 3rd year we've done it. We've had 92 cities participate. We select 5 winners every year. And this is an opportunity for any city to really gain capacity in terms of how to become smart, sustainable, resilient. Cities that have won included Miami, Orlando, Austin, Louisville, many cities throughout North America. And if anybody from St. Louis is here, you should consider applying this year for our Readiness Challenge grant. The big distinction being is that not only do we help a city deal with these problems that we've talked about today, but next year we're going to be introducing so we could take that vacancy project, it could be one of the projects that are part of the application, and we could actually submit it for financing. Because we're lining up a lot of financing behind the challenge. So this is just an example. And it's very much based on stakeholder engagement. So the universities have to be involved. If Ameren supports it, that you get extra points because that's part of the stakeholder community. So you have a lot of people in the room here who could really participate in making St. Louis one of the Smart City winners next year. And I think you'd see great benefits from that.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
That's great. So once again, round of applause. Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you. John, Phil, thank you very much.